Welcome back to another episode of the Isn't That Rich podcast. Today we are talking about a hot button topic which has become the norm in the United States, and it's all about tipping and tip culture within the US. So we're going to talk about the history of tipping, how it came to be what it was, and how it's definitely shifted in the past few years.
Yeah. So I remember when we were trying to come up with more podcast episodes, and I had seen an article about like tip fatigue and how it's just this new phenomenon that's happened after COVID. So people are just kind of tipped out.
And it's so true, because I know I was at Subway the other day, and I mean, it's a kind of a self-serve thing. You go in there, they make your sandwich, you leave. It's not like you're paying for full service. That's what tipping used to be, right? For full service restaurant. And now it's everywhere you go, you have the option to add on a tip, which just kind of feels everywhere. Like...
Yeah, and then you're like at self-checkout, like, can I tip myself? Right. Why aren't we tipping ourselves? Right?
It's definitely become like a recent conversation topic, because like if you're on social media, you're seeing all these videos of people making jokes about it and baristas.
What is it they say? If I'm standing, I'm not tipping. Is that what it is?
That's what a lot of people are saying. Yeah.
Well, I feel like all these comedians are saying
so there's
that.
a lot of controversy right now going around the topic of tipping, and so we want to talk about it and talk about the history of it and what it means, how it got originated, and why is it so big in America versus other countries.
Yeah, and I didn't realize that. Jill's been doing some research, and I didn't realize that it's really, truly more of an American thing than any place else, correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely... Well, do you guys even know what it means, tip? It's actually an acronym. It's short for to ensure promptness. Okay. So the history is it didn't really come to the U.S. until post-Civil War, which is really interesting. So after the Civil War, there were 4 million people living in the United States that all of a sudden were employable. So now instead of, essentially from slavery, right? So after the Civil War, all of these people were free and could be employed. And so it was very interesting. It came from Europe. The concept was from Europe. So these rich American travelers would go visit Europe, and actually tip was written on signs in London. Like if you wanted your server to come to you faster, you would give them a little tip in this little jar that said, to ensure promptness, add coins. And so they would throw a couple coins in this thing, your server would come to you faster. And then it came to the U.S. at post-Civil War, essentially. And it wasn't well received at first. It wasn't well received. People thought it was kind of degrading, that you would have to pay more for service. And people really didn't like the idea of, this was like this new free enterprise country where, you pay for what you get, and they didn't like to have to bribe people. Essentially, it was seen as a bribery.
Right.
So that was really interesting. And then, people paid these 4 million new people in the workforce. They didn't even pay them a minimum wage.
They didn't have a wage?
They didn't have a wage, or it was very, very small. There is an example of maybe 25 cents a week, $800 a year, which in today's money would be like living on a wage of $10,000 a year. So it's very, very low wages. And then they expected people to tip to make up for their low wages, which is kind of the way it is now, still to this day.
Right.
And they didn't actually impose a minimum wage for tips employees till recently. It was 1966 when they imposed like a minimum wage for tipped employees. So it's still to this day very much that way, which is so interesting. Damn. I know. And post-Civil War, this is another thing, is like what was really happening in the United States during that time. Well, rail was becoming really huge. And when rail cars, they all of a sudden, I forget the name of the guy. It was the Pullman Company. So George Pullman created sleep cars. So you could travel across the United States and you could get to where you wanted to go by staying in these luxury sleep cars. Well, he would hire young Black men to be porters. And porters, their job was essentially, if you think of like a stewardess or like somebody that would take your luggage from you and put it in the trains, and then they would essentially wait on you. They'd like shine your shoes. They would press your clothing as they were staying on this luxury sleep car. And he was the one who really kind of instated this tipping policy. So customers of these train cars could tip to pay for their employee or to pay for their service, essentially. Yeah. Whatever level of the service they thought they were receiving, they would tip. So kind of interesting.
Really cool. Kind of happened on the railway.
Kind of happened in the railway, kind of happened in the hospitality industry as well. So back in the day, restaurants weren't a thing. It was literally, you would go to a hotel when the food was included. Customers would pay the servers tips to get more food. So all of a sudden these hotels were losing out on a bunch of money because the servers were giving these guests
more of the product.
And so they wanted it separated out. And then your food was one and you'd tip for that. You'd still have to tip those employees. And then your hotel stay was a different expense. So kind of interesting.
Great. So that's why we have to pay more now.
Yeah.
All because of the hotels.
So the root of tipping culture is kind of not rooted in like integrity.
No, it really isn't.
It's a little...
And it was a way to make the businesses more profitable so they didn't have to pay their workers. Yeah. So very interesting.
I always thought that was weird growing up when you would hear like minimum wage and then you would hear what restaurant workers minimum wage was, and it was like so tiny. And I'm like, how did they live off that? Right. Well, they're like expecting their pay to be supplemented by these tips. Then if you think about it, it's like, what if no one comes to the restaurant and you don't get tips that day?
Right.
You're getting paid less than everybody else.
Yeah.
Really weird.
Like a gamble, I guess.
It is. And I think it's really hard for employees that are tipped to even have consistency. You know, that's really a hard thing is not having consistency in your paycheck because you're depending on those tips. Right. And then it also goes to what if your employer is giving specific people certain shifts that are always the great tipping shifts? Like there's so much rooted in tipping culture. It's crazy. We can talk about some of the things that have prompted the evolution of tips into what it is today, how it was usually just in the hospitality industry to everywhere you go, what it feels like today, if you want to.
Absolutely.
I think one of the main things is that we're seeing so much increased of digital payment systems. I mean, in the past 10 years, there never used to be a point of sale. You would just go up to the cash register and you'd pay for your meal, or your server would take your ticket and you'd leave money. But now everywhere there's a digital payment system in your face.
Literally everywhere. You go to Panera, that's like the first one I think of. It's right there in your face. You go to Seven Brew, they've got their iPad, they throw it in your car. Yeah. Like everywhere. There's a screen in your face.
Yeah. They flip it around.
They're like, can you answer a few questions for me real quick? I'm like,
$1, $2, 20%, 30%, 40%. You're like, okay, well,
$20 or 20%.
Like, if you want to sign your signature for using your card, you have to go through like 5 screens of.
It is yes or no.
I'm sure you don't want to tip.
Are you sure? Are you sure?
But it makes it so much easier to tip.
It is, absolutely.
And even on your receipts now, you'll see it printed. You have the option of 15% at the bottom. It'll say like, oh, suggested tip amount. If you want to do 15%, it's this amount. 18%, it's this amount. 20, this, 20. I mean, I've seen it where like even the start of the tip is like 20%. So it'll go all the way up to like 20, 22, 25%. And you have to choose between them. And you're like, what if I only want 18? Did you figure that? Like I only want to tip 18.
What were you guys taught growing up as like the proper tip amount? Mine's 20%. Like that's what I've always done.
It was 18 for a while, but now it has moved up to 20%.
Well, it's creeping more towards 25. Yeah.
No, do more than that. And she's like counting coins and putting on the table.
Grandma Joanne was a nurse her entire life, and she's like, she doesn't, guys. Sometimes she just doesn't tip. She's like, nobody tipped me. I'm like, Grandma, you were a nurse. You were paid full good wages.
But it goes to say there is some type of guilt that is placed on like the burden of the customer is so much more. So like now the customer is supposed to be responsible for tipping rather than the employer paying a just salary, a just wage. And that is a whole nother conversation, but
they prey on your, this necessarily tipping, but they're like, would you like to donate $2 to the Starving Children in Africa Fund, and if you don't, they're still starving. And you're like, sure,
and camera in your face.
They're like staring at you, like, do you hate starving children?
I'm a good person.
No, fine, I'll round up.
But I mean, I think different personalities probably tip more because of guilt.
Yeah. Well, Jill, you just said the word round up, and that reminds me of what we talked about yesterday. Would you explain kind of, I think it's in Europe, you said that they do more of like a roundup instead of a...
For sure. So tipping isn't necessarily prevalent everywhere in the world. I mean, there are some countries, we can talk about this more in a little bit, but there are some countries that, they'll include a service fee in their bill. So you'll just get the service fee. It includes a tip, and they'll pay those workers that tip out of it without having to say, add a tip in addition. And we have service fees too. If you'd look, there are service fees included, but this would be paid out to the restaurant. In some places, they even say, rather than leaving the server tip, you would just round up. So if say your $17 was your bill, you would round up to 20, and that was completely fine. So interesting.
Okay, so you do round up.
You do round up.
Yeah. So obviously there's a bunch of like economic pressures and wage stagnation with inflation happening and everything like that. I think one things that I'm noticing is specifically like the Gen Z generation is tipping more because they see this, and this is what I'm basically saying. I'm a millennial, so I can't speak on behalf of Gen Z, but what I'm seeing on social media is they understand the need of like supporting each other, which, because of inflation and the cost of everything. So I see Gen Zers, and this is through like running the coffee shop, they tip probably double what a millennial or a boomer would tip, because I think that there's this understanding that we have to support each other during tough times. And I just feel like that's like a concept that Gen Zers are grasping more than boomers and millennials. So in my opinion, I feel like Gen Z is growing tipping culture more than any generation.
So you're going to be Grandma Joanna in a few years.
I'm Grandma Joe. No, I like to tip, but I don't think I'm Gen Z. We don't know what I am. I'm the weird one that's like, I don't know, 97, whatever that is. So
no, but there is more of a culture acceptance with younger generations that tipping is just a thing and it's not going away.
It's less about to ensure promptness, because I don't think most Gen Zers or millennials even knew what tip meant. No. I think it's just this understanding of this person lives off of tips, and it's hard to live in this society.
That's exactly it, Jared.
So we got to support each other and get through this.
Yeah. And I don't think that's what it's about now. I don't think tipping means what it means. Like you said, I don't think it means like this is for promptness. This is exactly what you said. So that's a really good point.
Like, this is the way it is, and we got to survive through this. Yeah. And how do we survive through this? But the question is, should there be tips, or should that be like changed within the food industry, within hospitality? Because Europe is now, like you're saying, changing.
So in the past, there's been several attempts to do away with tips. And in fact, back in the early 1900s, there was this movement to, get rid of tips within the United States, just pay a fair wage to these people instead of having the tip. In Europe, a lot of places, they do that. They just, instead of, the tip is just extra, but they also pay a very large minimum wage there. So where our minimum wage, the federal minimum wage is $7.25 right now. So $7.25 an hour is the federal minimum wage here in Illinois, for tipped employees rather.
Yeah.
And here it's $8.25 in Illinois.
Oh, wow.
So
my thing is, I wonder if for tipped employees, if there was a vote, let's say the government, let's put it up for a vote, would they pick to have a higher wage, no tip, or keep the wage and tip? Because if they are getting tipped and you're making good money, I wonder.
That's the question. Like, would you rather have a guaranteed $15 an hour minimum wage, or would you hope to rather work on tips?
Yeah. I think it depends on the personality. I think we're seeing this too. I remember, at the coffee shop, there'd be people, they wanted the same amount. Mm-hmm. So they'd be like on a salary, or they like the tips. Cause I think there's people that are like naturally salesman type of people that like are motivated by commission.
They like to earn like that. They like to be paid differently.
So they like to be paid different. And you see a lot of those people in like commission based, jobs,
right?
But not everyone wants that. They don't like the pressure of that. So it's interesting.
Yeah. I've even been to restaurants that have raised their prices, and on the restaurants, like some of the fine dining places will say the tip is included in your bill. Mm-hmm. And the prices of the food is much exponentially higher than what other restaurants, other full service restaurants, but they're attempting to get rid of that pressure on the customer.
Yeah.
That feels that they need to always have to tip or have to give another. I mean, it's become norm. Like every time you go to a restaurant, you're just expected to pay another 20% of the bill, which is kind of crazy.
So what are your thoughts on when gratuity is added, but then there's still the form that's like adding a tip?
Oh, I don't tip after that.
Okay.
Because
tipping.
Yeah, because I've been in situations where gratuity is added, but because I'm kind of guilt driven, I'm like, oh, I still have to fill this other part out and add a tip. It's kind of confusing,
go ahead. I was going to say, like, I love the guilt thing because you guys know I like cash. And so sometimes I don't want to tip on my tip on the receipt. Like if I paid with my debit card, and if I tip with cash, I feel like I've found myself times writing like on the receipt or something like up front. Like if you have to go pay it front, I'm like, I paid them. Like right. I promise I put money on the table.
You're proving to them that you left a tip.
I swear.
Yeah. But it's true. There's so much guilt in it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know.
What are your thoughts on like if everything was gratuity, where every time you went out, there was like a certain percentage taken out no matter what?
You mean taxes?
Oh gosh.
Just kidding.
It's a whole other episode.
Right.
Yeah. No, but it does kind of start to feel that way. Like, I mean, I understand if the service is going above and beyond, or, but I do feel that it's getting to be to the point where I don't understand. Yeah. Why should the responsibility be on the consumer to pay those rather than the businesses?
Yeah.
Cause it's tricky. This is kind of like, as someone who's like ran a business in hospitality, cause you do tips and everything, but you think about it, but like, I feel like it is the business owner's responsibility to hire people that provide that hospitality. That should be the bare minimum. So to say that the tip is dependent, so the amount of hospitality and like excellence of service that you receive is now dependent upon a tip.
When they should just be giving you good service anyway. Right. Is that what you're saying?
The good service should just be part of the company's standard culture, and those people should be paid rewarded like great. You know what I mean?
Yeah, because the business is, we know this from like our business, your business will excel and it'll be making more money. Then you can pay people more.
Interesting.
Right. It's cyclical. Definitely cyclical. If your employees are happy, your customers are happy.
Exactly.
Yeah, I get it. I also think, just because we were talking about like how things have shifted, and we talked about, I mentioned Subway, that I had a tip the other day at Subway. I think there are so many more other apps, like quick service apps that require you to tip. Now you think of like these drivers for Uber Eats or whatever it is. DoorDash, there's different services available now giving you the opportunity to tip. What do I have Instacart, and I love Instacart.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's cheap for the service that I get. Jared, you live in Marion. Why are you using Instacart?
I hate the grocery store.
Because Jared loves to throw money away.
I hate going to the grocery store. I love Instacart. And of course, Jill got me hooked on it.
I know. It's so nice. But for
Jill's like messaging her Instacart driver. She's like, here's my code to my house. Go in, put it all in my fridge.
I have done that.
Happened the other day.
I have done that. I love it, and I will tip for those services, but I think it's at least
my fear is like my thought goes two ways when it comes to like Grubhub or like DoorDash or whatever, is if I don't put the tip on there or like a good tip,
they're going to eat your fries.
Are they going to like throw
They're gonna eat your
my
fries.
tidy at the window, you know, and then drive off? You know, like, are they not going to show up for 5 hours?
Exactly.
Or another, like, it's a little more compassionate side is like, is this person only living off of the tip?
Right.
And they're driving to my house at like 10 p.m.
And you know, the gas prices are crazy.
Yeah.
So you're thinking about that.
That's not an easy, I'm sure most people don't want to be working at 10 p.m. on a weeknight and delivering food. But if they're living off that, it's my responsibility to make sure that I'm tipping appropriately.
Yeah.
But also they're employed by a company that should be paying them, right?
Exactly.
Such a debate. It's crazy.
Such a beautiful debate.
We said it would be a hot topic. For sure. I want to go over some of the countries and like what their tipping percentages, because I find it really interesting. Yeah. So this is a few of the countries. So the United States, it's 15 to 20% is typical. In Canada, it's very similar to here, which I don't know. When I was in Canada, I don't remember tipping like that.
Never been to Canada.
Maybe I was bad.
I feel like when I was in Canada, they always handed out these
You've
little
been to Canada
personal...
The devices, the point of sale systems.
Point of sale systems to everybody. So it was like private. It wasn't, I don't know.
There was less guilt.
Kind of different. There was less guilt.
So I didn't see Ashley leaving her $2 tip and I only left 50 cents.
Right.
Well, there's less guilt at Chili's and Olive Garden as well. They give you your little kiosk and they're like, have a nice day.
Oh my God.
After they give you your mints.
Yeah. So listen to this. Mexico, tipping is expected in restaurants and for services like taxis and hotel staff, but it's much lower. It's like 10 to 15%. Wow. Brazil, 10% service charge is often included in your bills at restaurants. So it's included rather than like, here's the tip line for you to leave extra. In the UK, a tip of 10 to 15% is expected in restaurants if a service charge is not already included. But tipping in pubs and for other services, so like if you go to a bar, you don't leave your bartender a tip, which is where I leave my bartender the biggest tips, I think. Yeah. You know?
I feel like that's almost our biggest
like
place too.
Like,
I'm like, they're not getting paid at all. We have to pay them.
Yeah.
And then, I know we're going through this, but then it's like, the question is, do you tip the same across the board? Do you tip the person cutting your hair 20%? Do you tip your
don't get me started.
Your bartender 20%? Because I feel like personally, I tip differently, different places, and I don't know where I adapted that. But like, if I order like a cocktail drink, I'm probably tipping almost 50%.
Do you know that when I worked at the med spa and people would get Botox and fillers, some of the girls would ball out and tip 20% of their bill to the nurse that did their Botox. And I'm like, and I know they're getting paid a lot already. And then these people are tipping like,
but I've done that. I've been to a med spa and tipped for those services.
Right. And then some
I'm like,
people,
so that's the culture
but it's because it prompted you.
It prompted
and
you.
you probably were like, what? Okay, I guess. And then you don't want to be that girl at the med spa that's not tipping.
Or you're going to get a bad Botox injection because you didn't tip last time. I don't know.
Sorry, we can keep going. We can keep going
out
these
of
countries,
fear or out of like compassion. There's no other.
Yes.
But the same, I think hair salons operate differently.
Yeah.
Their people either totally live off of even a percentage of their tips or all of it, or, you know, it's like.
You have to think of like hair salons too. They're paying for that chair. So they're paying fees to be there. So how do you compensate them? Yeah. Cause it's you. You're the customer. You're the one that you hired them.
Right.
So
Right.
You're the employer, so to say. This was interesting too. Italy and France, service charges are included, but this is where it was rounding up, Ashley, where we talked about this. So in Italy, a lot of times you just round up the bill rather than leaving a specific tip for the server. Okay. Australia and New Zealand, tipping's not customary, but it is becoming more common in urban areas, and it's only around 10% in restaurants. Japan, tipping is not customary and can even be considered rude.
Really?
Right. Like bribery, like we talked about how it used to be viewed in the US, like more of a bribe.
Because it says as excellent service is expected without additional gratuity.
Right. Go Japan.
It's a cultural expected to be excellent.
Yeah.
I personally agree with that.
I agree.
I think we should.
100%.
It's good.
So countries where it's less common or discouraged is China, South Korea. We've got a lot more. Malaysia, Singapore, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, which I was kind of taken back that tipping is not customary.
Didn't you go there?
No. I've never been to Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, but I think Luke, our producer, was there, and he would agree that tipping's not customary. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. I think most of the Nordic countries, it's not.
I wonder if it's always been that way or if they're kind of the ones that had it and then got rid of it.
That I do not know.
Yeah.
I don't know, but
I'm just imagining me like in Norway, whatever Norway looks like, don't know. And I just go to this restaurant and they don't ask for a tip or anything. I'd be like, well, I'm just filthy rich now. That's how I'd feel. With all this money I can spend. I can buy the filet every day.
No, so interesting. But I mean, it's very different from wherever you are. So make sure if you are traveling abroad that you're checking out what the tip culture is like in those countries. Because it's definitely not going to be the same as the US.
And definitely don't, like, if you're traveling to Japan and it's like, if it's considered rude or insulting to tip, you need to know that.
For sure.
So I think that's a hard thing too, especially for Americans, is we like to travel overseas and go on these vacations and stuff like that without understanding the culture that we're going into and offending everybody without realizing it, because
stupid
our culture
Americans
is so different.
Why is this $5 bill offensive?
Why are you offended by this?
You offend me.
Yeah.
I don't know. But I could go on and on about how tip culture has just become such a crazy thing in the US. And I think it's here to stay, you guys. I don't think it's going anywhere. I think it's so embedded.
I do too. And especially like what you said about Gen Z and it's their thing. If it's their thing, it's not.
Yeah.
It's probably not going anywhere.
I feel, this is my prediction, personal prediction. Gen Z will uphold it, but I think I don't know the generation after Gen Z, but I feel like that generation will see how crazy and chaotic tipping culture is and start to bring reform in that.
And change wages,
so we may be dead by then, but that's my prediction.
Well, my prediction is that it's going to be too much for the consumer to handle shortly. I feel like it's getting to be so high up there that we're having to pay 30% more than we did at January 1st for a carton of orange juice now, that we just aren't going to be able to handle it anymore. So some kind of reform is going to happen sooner or later. I don't know.
I'm wondering, I'm like you, I'm wondering if that's a thing that kind of, we're in this stagflation, inflation, whatever you want to call it right now. But if tipping is maybe this portion of it that, like you said, the consumer can't handle, and what it actually ends up being what causes us to like back off of spending money. And then maybe they'll drop the prices on eggs. I don't know.
You're not going to be going to quick service restaurants anymore. Yeah, where you used to be able to just spend $5 on a footlong. Now you're spending $8 on a 6-inch, right? Like, yeah. Interesting topic. I think this was a fun conversation that we had.
And I think it's important for people listening to like consider the culture that you grew up in, how you were raised in tipping, see if it matches with culture of other people. I think we each have our own way because our grandparents, our parents taught us, but it's not really something that we talk about really. So I think a lot of people are doing different things. I think the more that we talk about it, the more we kind of understand, like, to get on the same page with it.
Yeah, for sure. So thanks for having this conversation, guys. I think it was enlightening.
I do too. I love the history of it. The history is so fascinating.
It really is. And there's even more to it, like Prohibition kind of really ingrained it into our culture. So it was that whole post-Civil War and then Prohibition really set it into play. Well, thanks for listening, everyone. We'll see you next week.
So, Jill, where do we go from here?
Be sure to check out our show notes for this episode, and also be sure to follow us on social media and subscribe to our newsletter. We'll see you next week.
See you next week.